High school is the worst. Having to be there in the early hours of the day and not leaving until the teachers are satisfied with torturing teenagers with information they will probably forget by the time they graduate. Not to mention all the tests and extracurricular stuff they have to do. Mostly clubs and whatnot, but some have more attention attracting stuff. Hugo was one of those guys, the stereotypical jock that played football. Was good too. Not as good as his captain, but still pretty damn good. Sadly, that was one of the only things he was good at, exercising, which meant that his grades tended to suffer. His parents weren't overly strict about it, but they did not want their son to have to repeat a year just because he found his club more important than studying. It went pretty well in the first 3 years of high school, but the things they were teaching suddenly got more difficult. Which is why Hugo Lowe found himself in one of the more abandoned parts of the school building, in a study hall, catching up on his homework that he had left for later. He knew that if he were to go home, he would not do it. His family is great, but having two younger sisters meant that he had to give some free time to them if he still wanted to be a good big brother, and to give his parents a little rest from the 6-year-old twins. And the reason why he chose a more out-of-the-way part of the building was solely because of his pride. He did not want his friends to see that he had been struggling more than they already knew. Yes, jocks were mostly seen as stupid, but his teammates were actually pretty smart. Also one of the reasons he didn't ask them for help. Another part of his stupid pride. So far, he had gone over English, the easiest out of the way first. Science, surprisingly not as difficult as he thought, and was on his way through math, the subject he hated the most. He could just not wrap his mind around it. It seemed like all the numbers and formulas were laughing at him, mocking him for being stupid. Not to mention, he had been at this for about 3 hours now, with no break, so he was starting to become a little crazy. Hugo groaned and rubbed his eyes. The formula before him was starting to become fuzzy, and he felt a headache coming up. He turned his head to look out the window and cursed slightly as he noticed that the sun was starting to drop. He had been at it for too long, but he was almost done. He was pretty sure that half of his answers to the math questions were wrong, but at this point he didn't care. Hugo sighed and focused on the page in his book once more. He squinted his eyes and tried to erase the squiggly image of the formula. Yep, he was absolutely sure that it was laughing at him. You could see the smirk in the numbers. The room turned colder and Hugo shivered. He shrugged it off though and continued to glare at the page. The right side of his head got colder, and just as he tried to look, he heard something. If you divide the first two numbers by 4, you get the answer. Hugo froze at the whisper, but soon enough turned his head, his eyes wide in horror. They got comically bigger as he saw a white figure next to him. He screamed and scrambled backwards over the table. His math book went flying with him, but he did not take his eyes off of the white figure, who was also mortified by him. The white figure screamed as soon as he did, and after Hugo landed on his ass on the floor, they both just stared at each other for an uncomfortable while. Hugo's heart was racing with anxiety. His fight or flight reflexes wanted to kick in, but he was honestly too scared to move. The figure before him was small, but it was floating, so it loomed over him. He also noticed that it was a girl. Her hair looked dark grayish, but that was probably because there was a white mist covering her body. She had on silver round glasses and a large purple turtleneck sweater. Her jeans were blue, but her feet were almost entirely white, so he wasn't sure if she was wearing shoes or not. Her wide eyes were a green-blue color. The ghost girl blinked a couple times, calming down, it seemed. She nervously smiled and raised a hand, hovering closer to Hugo. "Hi," she said, her voice echoing in the room. "I'm Kiara. What's your name?" It took a couple seconds for Hugo to understand that she was talking to him. So he yelled again, scrambling to pick up his stuff while the ghost girl, Kiara, tried to calm him down. As soon as he got all of his stuff in order, he bolted out of the door. Hugo was very glad that he did sports because he was sure that he just broke his record of a 400-meter dash. He didn't even stop when he made it out of the school. He luckily stopped screaming, but his legs did not until he was at his house. Hugo slammed the door shut behind him and finally took a deep breath in, trying to calm his racing heart. He leaned on the door and sat down as he suddenly became very tired. He closed his eyes to try and make something of what had happened just a few minutes earlier. "Hugo, are you okay?" His mother's voice snapped him out of his racing thoughts, and he looked up to see her staring at him with concern. He needed to get his shit back together. He smiled at her and stood up on shaky legs, hoping his mother didn't catch that. "Yeah, sorry." He was still slightly panting. "Decided that it was a good idea to sprint home after sitting for a few hours. Seems like I overestimated myself." He chuckled, trying to make it sound genuine and not awkward. His mother sighed and gave him a small smile. "Just be careful. You have to know your own limits." She gave him a kiss on the cheek and moved his hair out of his eyes. "Dinner is ready. Freshen up a bit before you come and eat, okay?" Hugo smiled back and nodded, glad that his mother bought the lie. Well, he wasn't lying technically. He did run all the way home, but that was mostly out of fear, not practice. Hugo sighed and walked behind his mother to the kitchen. He said hello to his father and little sisters before he made his way up the stairs to his room. He closed the door behind him and collapsed face first on his bed. He groaned and turned around. First, dinner with the family. Then he can ponder about the ghost girl. Yeah, good plan. Hugo was very much distracted by the ghost girl during dinner. His parents noticed his absent mind and even asked him about it, but Hugo assured them that he was okay, just that he was tired from studying. After they were done, he asked if he could be excused, and his parents agreed, knowing that he really needed his rest right now. His little sisters wanted to play with him, but he said that they could do that tomorrow. Hugo knew that it would make them sad, but he really needed to get his thoughts straight. He once again collapsed on his bed, but this time on his back. He stared at the ceiling for a while before closing his eyes and thinking back to earlier. Hugo was pretty sure that it was a ghost that he had seen. Although he never really believed in them, it didn't mean he wasn't open to the idea that there was more on this planet than just humans. Now that he thought about it more, it seemed like that she had been very nervous. Well, they did both scream at each other. A chuckle came from his lips. It had been pretty funny if you didn't count the almost heart attack part. A sudden thought entered him and he groaned. His friends once told him about a rumor that had been going around the school. Something happened to a high school student a long time ago, and they now haunted the school. Bullshit, is what he thought when he heard it. It was just a rumor. He now realized that it was real. The ghost girl, Kiara, was the high schooler in the rumors. It hadn't looked like she was from a very long time ago, maybe the last century, but not hundreds of years ago like the rumors made it sound. It kind of looked like she was from the 70s or 80s, judging by her outfit, and those large round glasses were also a big sign to those times. Hugo suddenly sat up. He jumped off of his bed and went to his desk. He rummaged inside his drawers and found his old sketchbook. He had thrown drawing aside when he started high school, but he had been pretty good. He didn't want his friends to find him weird for drawing, so he stopped. He grabbed a pencil and eraser and sat down at his desk. He flipped through it and smiled when he saw his old sketches. He made it to a new page and halted for a second. Should he do this? Was there not some kind of warning against drawing ghostly figures or something? Hugo shook his head and glided the pencil onto the page. He could tell it had been a long time since he took sketching seriously. His first attempt was not good enough for him, so he flipped to the next page and drew the ghost again. He kept this up for a couple hours until his mother told him to go to bed. Hugo looked at the clock and chuckled, as he noticed it was past midnight. It had been a very long time since he forgot the time while drawing, but he was satisfied with the portrait he made from the ghost girl. He ripped it out of his sketchbook and folded the paper so it could fit inside the front pocket of his backpack. He would go back tomorrow. He wanted to apologize and see if she was kind. He had to finish his homework anyway. Now that he knew about the ghost girl, the old building suddenly felt really eerie. It was colder than the main building, even with the air conditioning blasting throughout it. He took his time, really looking at the structure and the halls. He just walked through it yesterday without thinking about it too much, which was probably why it felt different now. The walls were covered in cobwebs, and it was no longer a white color, but more like a dark cream. There were almost no lockers, but a few were still standing against the wall, dented and dirty. The ground was full of dust and even a few leaves that had blown inside through the broken windows. It really did look like a scene in a haunted movie. The school did not care about it anymore, since the new part of the building now held the main classrooms and such. Maybe the janitor still came here to store his stuff, or some other books teachers might need, but overall it was really abandoned. Hugo made it to the study hall he had been to yesterday, and cautiously walked inside. Aside from a few tables and chairs, the room was empty. He put his backpack on a table and took a spin. He took in a deep breath and cleared his throat. "Hello? Kiara?" It was like his voice had an echo effect as it resounded across the room. He turned around and yelped when he noticed that Kiara had appeared in front of him. He took a step back, but calmed himself when he noticed she was smiling. "Hello," she said, waving at him again. "Hi," he smiled back. "I wanted to say sorry about yesterday. I kind of freaked out." He rubbed the back of his head and averted his eyes, embarrassment radiating off him. He looked back at her and saw that she had tilted her head and was poking her pointy fingers together. "No need to apologize. I was also freaked out. Nobody had ever seen me before." Hugo couldn't help but think that her shyness was cute. "You're the first one." She turned her eyes back to him, but looked away again as she noticed that he was staring at her as well. Hugo chuckled. "Well, I didn't know I could see ghosts as well." He frowned. "Wait, do you know that you're a ghost?" He had to ask. There were theories on the internet that people who were dead and reappeared as ghosts didn't know that they were dead. He just wanted to make sure. Kiara nodded. "Yeah, I remember a little bit from when I died." She let the question of how she died hanging in the air. Hugo really wanted to know, but he also didn't want to intrude. By the way she reacted, it was not pleasant. "Sorry for asking." Hugo sat down on the table, while Kiara hovered closer to him. "It's okay." She smiled at him again, and he patted the spot next to him. Kiara blinked a couple times before slowly making her way over and sitting down on the wooden surface. It was colder with her next to him, but Hugo didn't mind. This was the first time he had ever spoken to a ghost, and he didn't really want it to end. "I must admit," he started, turning to her, "I am really curious about you. Is there anything you can tell me from before you died?" He put on his best puppy eyes, and he could see the color on Kiara's cheeks becoming a bit darker. He counted that as a win. Wait, was he flirting with a ghost? Well... Her voice brought him out of his thoughts, and he saw her playing with her hair, looking off to the side. I was born about 1965. I can't exactly remember when, but I died in the early 80s, so around that time. I was going to this high school, and... She trailed off. I died here too, so... Her voice cracked. Hewo wanted to hug her. It must have been scary, being alone for almost 50 years. Kiara. She looked at him. I really want to hug you right now, but I'm scared I will go through you. He raised a brow. She giggled and reached out her hand. She softly put it on his cheek, and while it was cold, it did not go through his flesh. She recoiled in shock and looked at her palm. She looked back at him, and her hand again. Hewo watched her in amusement, weirdly happy that she was too. Kiara reached out to him again, but this time to his hair. She ran her fingers through his curly hair, and he had to admit that it felt nice. Her hand was cold and his head was warm, so it felt good. Kiara giggled again, and Hewo chuckled. Can I hug you now? He asked. Kiara looked elated and wrapped her arms around his neck, leaning in. Hewo in return wrapped his arms around her back and put his head in her neck. She did the same, and they just held each other for a couple moments. It was weird hugging a ghost, but surprisingly very comfortable. Thank you, Hewo, she whispered in his ear. Hewo blinked and moved his hands to her waist to slightly push her back so he could look at her face. She pouted when she could no longer hug him. He squinted at her. How do you know my name? He cautiously asked. Kiara giggled again and grinned. It was on your notebook. I was watching you for a while before I said something yesterday. She sheepishly looked to the side, the grin not leaving her face. Hewo rolled his eyes and shook his head. All right, I guess, though you shouldn't spy on people. He poked her nose, still fascinated that his hand didn't go through her. She crinkled her nose and raised a brow. It was like the shy girl from moments ago was completely gone. People can't see me. It doesn't matter if I spy on them or not. She looked a bit sad, and Hewo wanted to slap it off her face. He did not, but it was just a thought that went through his head to try and get her to smile again. Although slapping her probably would have made her even more sad, or maybe even angry. He had to try and get her to focus on something else. Are you good at math? He released her waist, and she lowered her arms. She nodded, and Hewo jumped off the table, shocking Kiara, who flew back into the air. I noticed that you knew how to look at the formulas, and I really need to get my homework done. Will you help me? He held up his backpack, and a smile wormed its way back up her face. Hewo got out his math book and stuff to get started. He sat down, on a chair this time, and let Kiara hover next to him. She helped him through the rest of his homework, and he was surprised that he understood parts of it now. The way she explained it made it sound so easy. He had to ask his teacher why he didn't just explain it like this in the beginning, instead of giving them a damn formula for a formula that did nothing to help him whatsoever. Hewo stretched his arms above his head and heard a satisfying crack in his back. They hadn't been going at it for that long, but he had been very attentive. He fished his phone from his pocket and checked the time. What's that? He turned to Kiara, who had her full attention to the phone in his hand. Hewo blinked. That's right. She didn't grow up with a smartphone. It's a phone. He showed her the screen and tapped it on. You can call with it and even send messages to other people. It's basically a portable phone. Pretty much everyone has one nowadays. Her eyes sparkled at the device as Hewo showed her some apps and what they did. That is really cool. I wish I had something like that back when I was alive. She suddenly had a far-off look on her face. I might still be alive if I had something like that, she mumbled. Hugo still heard it. He decided not to ask about it. Kiera was already very closed off about her death, and he didn't want to push her. He was so curious, though. Well, you can use it whenever I'm here. I don't mind. He shrugged. It was quiet for a bit too long, and he locked eyes with Kiera. She looked shocked, surprised. You want to come back? Her voice cracked, and a ghost tear fell down her cheek. Hugo smiled. Of course. He grabbed her hand. I like hanging out with you. You may be dead, but that doesn't mean we can't be friends. Kiera squeezed his hand hard. She put her other hand over her mouth, trying to keep her sobs from coming out. She was unsuccessful. I'm sorry, she hiccuped, fanning her face to try and keep her tears in. It didn't do much. No one really liked me back then. They only used me. Thank you. She gave him a watery smile. Hugo stood up and pulled her into a hug. It felt like his heart was torn into pieces by her words. She was probably bullied when she was alive. Those are the worst kind of people. I'll be back tomorrow after school, I promise, he murmured in her hair. Kiera nodded and squeezed him one last time before letting go. Hugo shared a smile with her, but it was very watery for both of them. He hadn't even realized he had started crying as well. Kiera wiped away his tears and did the same to her own. Tomorrow, I promise, she whispered before her body started to fade. Hugo saw her body disappear before his eyes and gaped. It was kind of cool to see that. He shook his head. Not the time to think about that. He grabbed his stuff and put them back in his backpack. Before he walked out of the door, he looked back into the study room and smiled. See you soon, Kiera, he called out. He heard a soft giggle, and it sent shivers down his spine. He walked out the door and gently closed it behind him. Wow, he was actually friends with a ghost. Who knew his life could take that weird of a turn? Hugo was glad school was over. He could not stop thinking about Kiera the entire day. It was weird. He had only really talked to her yesterday, but he felt like he had known her for years. She was kind and helpful. Of course, the most prominent reason was because she was a ghost, although that somehow was just a tiny thought in the back of his head. As soon as the bell rang, he raced to the door and towards his locker. He grabbed the books he needed and was about to close his locker when a hand grabbed the door of the locker. Hugo looked at the hand and then up at the person's face. It was his coach. Impromptu training session. Come on, his coach said, grabbing his wrist and dragging Hugo with him. Wait, coach, I have to be somewhere now. Hugo tried to get out of the coach's grip, but he just wouldn't budge. He could not be taken now. He had to go to Kiera. He promised her he would be there right after school. I don't care, his coach said as they reached the locker rooms. Training takes priority over everything. Hugo rolled his eyes and wanted nothing more than to smack his coach on the head. He sometimes really hated the man. He did not care about any other activities the team might have and just ordered them to train. Some trying to leave, but only got penalties and had to stay longer. That didn't stop Hugo, though. He tried his best to sneak out multiple times, but the coach caught him every time and added more things to his training. Hugo wanted to scream. He didn't want to be here. He had promised Kiera he would be there, but it was already starting to get dark. Hugo just quickly finished his training, being the last one of the team to finish. As he was finally done with his last lap, before the coach could give him pointers, he sprinted towards the locker rooms. His coach wanted to follow him, but Hewo was somehow even faster than in the training earlier. Hewo didn't bother taking a shower or putting on his normal clothes. He just grabbed his backpack with all of his stuff and ran out of the room. He sprinted towards the old building and only stopped when he was in the study hall, leaning on his knees and panting. His legs were shaking from all the running, but he ignored it. Hewo straightened up and immediately froze in place. There she was. But it was different. Kiera was in the middle of the room. The white mist that had covered her body was now replaced by pitch black. Her back was turned to him, but he could tell something was really not good. The room was dark and colder than before. He could see his own breath as it still came out in pans, yet it was the middle of summer. Kiera! His teeth clattered together as he wrapped his arms around himself. His short-sleeved shirt and shorts clinging to his body with sweat. It felt like he was engulfed in ice. Kiera suddenly turned around. Hugo's breath hitched in his throat. Gone was the sweet smile and soft look. Her eyes were black, a white pupil in the middle. Her mouth was stretched into a black smile that almost reached her ears. Her hair was as dark as her eyes and floating upwards. Her face was white, scary white.
Hugo Low.
Her voice was sharp and low. A shiver racked through his entire body, and he was now shaking from the cold. Hugo blinked, and she was suddenly inches away from his face. Hugo wanted to move, but he was frozen to the ground. He was terrified. Her hand reached towards his face. It was black, and her nails were like claws.
You lied to me,
she whispered, laying her hand on his cheek. He flinched. It felt like his skin was burning off. I didn't mean to... Kiera tilted her head, tracing a sharp nail over his cheekbone, creating a small cut that started to bleed. Hugo ignored it. My coach, he grabbed me and forced me to practice. His eyes were pleading with her, begging her to come back to her senses, to believe him. Kiera got even closer to him and licked at the cut she made. Hugo shivered, willing himself to keep his head high. Kiera hummed as she tasted his blood. Please, Kiera. Hugo tried again, raising his hand and placing it on her cheek. Her skin was so cold. It took everything he had in him not to recoil. Come back, he whispered. Kiera blinked, one of her eyes turning back to the green-blue color he wanted to see. Hugo knew he was getting to her, but he needed to make sure she would become her normal self again. His other hand went to her other cheek, and he softly pulled her head down and kissed her forehead. Kiera gasped, and in a white flash, she was herself again. The white mist covering her once more, her eyes and mouth back to normal, although her lower lip was quivering. Tears were streaming down her face. You jerk! She gasped out and hit his chest. Hugo could feel the air getting knocked out of him, but that didn't stop him from embracing her. Even though he held her close, Kiera didn't stop hitting him. You said you would be here. You promised. Her voice cracked and a sob came out. She hit him one more time and relaxed against his hold, her head on his chest. I'm sorry, Kiera. As soon as the bell rang, I sprinted to my locker, but I was stopped by my coach. He forced an impromptu practice of football, and no matter how hard I tried to escape, he would haul me back and make me do more training. Hugo sighed. I was so angry, and I'm so sorry. He released her waist, but Kiara didn't let go of his shirt. Hugo kneeled down, and she let go in surprise. He bowed his head and gripped his thighs. I will do anything to make it up to you. His voice was strong and confident. Kiara sniffed and also kneeled down. As she was about to stroke his head, Hugo spoke up again. Please, just... He looked up at her. Never do something like that again. Please. He looked like he was in pain, and she gasped. Her hand went to his cheek, and she softly caressed the cut she made. I don't know what happened. I never felt so betrayed like that. I didn't know I could do that.
But you hurt me.
Her eyes turned black again. Kiara shook her head and her pupils came back. You also have to promise to never betray me like that again. If you want to continue being my friend after that. She mumbled the last part, her hand retracting. Hugo smiled softly. He grabbed her hand and kissed the back of it. Kiara immediately turned red and she squeaked. I was scared, I'll admit. He softly rubbed his thumb on the back of her hand. But I was also at fault. I could not stop thinking about you today. It was like you were always there, so yes. He locked eyes with her. I want to be your friend. Kiara sniffed again and launched herself at Hugo, embracing him tightly. He returned the hug, and the two sat there on the ground for who knows how long, just enjoying each other's presence. The two of them made a schedule. Hugo also gave Kiara an old flip phone. This way they could still communicate with each other. At the times he knew he would have practice, he would text her and let her know. And when he was free, he would go to the building and study with her. His teammates had no idea where he would go. They had asked, but he had not given them a solid answer. He wanted to keep this relationship with her as secret as possible. Also because his teammates wouldn't believe him if he told them he was friends with a ghost. Hanging out with Kiara has been so much fun. She was shy at the beginning, especially after her turning a bit crazy. But Hugo assured her that he understood her reaction. He had promised her and broken her trust, even though it was his coach who forced him. So he had to try and regain it. Luckily, she was back to trusting him very quickly, although that might not have been such a good trade. They had been talking and doing homework for a couple months now. Hugo's grades were starting to get better, and his parents were very happy. So were the teachers. His teammates were also happy that he seemed to be picking himself up. They asked if he was taking any lessons, but Hugo just replied that he had a very good teacher. It was one of those days where he just came to have a good time with Kiara. They had done his homework earlier that week, and he had no more to do. They started to explore the building. Can you leave this building? Hugo asked as they walked through the halls at a slow pace. Kiara shook her head. It's difficult. She was walking beside him, trying to get the hang of it again instead of just flying next to him all the time. I can go to the other school building, but I can't go outside. It takes way too much energy. I think it's because I died here, she explained. Hugo hummed. He had learned not to ask too many questions about how she died or the things that happened before that. Kiara would always get defensive, and her entire eyes would turn black. They turned around a corner and were shocked to see there was only one door. Hugo walked over to it, curiously eyeing the padlock on the door. It was rusty, and he would probably be able to pull it off. Want to see what's in there? He asked, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Kiara couldn't help but be curious as well, and nodded. She started flying and moved towards the door. A sudden boink startled Hugo as Kiara fell back with a yelp. I can't go through. Her voice was a little shaky. Hugo put a hand on her cold shoulder and turned her to him. "We don't have to if you think it's dangerous," he assured her. Kiera shook her head. "No." Her voice was clear. "This just makes me more curious." They gave each other a firm nod, and Hugo reached out to the padlock. He gripped it and pulled it down. The lock broke off and he dropped it to the floor. He grabbed the door handle and opened it. The door made a hard squeak as it was opened. It seemed like it hadn't been opened for years. The room was covered in dust. The tables and chairs were overturned, and the bookshelves were empty or completely overthrown with books. It looks like this was supposed to be a library. Kiera suddenly took his hand and he flinched slightly at the cold contact. When he turned to look at her, there was fear all over her face and she was shaking. Her eyes were focused on a part on the floor. He matched her gaze and walked over to a giant bookcase with a weird, dark brown color staining the floor. Kiera didn't move from her spot, so Hugo let her hand go. He kneeled down and touched the floor with his fingertips. It was dried up, so he didn't get it on his hands. He was too afraid to smell it, so he stood back up and looked at the way the dark brown color was spread across the floor. It surrounded the bookcase. Hugo gulped and turned to look at Kiera. She was still shaking. He wanted to take her out of here, but he was just so curious as to what happened and what was behind the bookcase. He took in a deep breath and walked over to the side of the case. He used all of his strength to push it aside. While the structure was heavy, the shelves were empty, so it was easier than Hugo had thought. As he was at the halfway point, he stopped and looked at what was behind the bookcase. His eyes widened in horror, and he gave a scream. His body scrambled back, and he landed on the floor inside the dark brown stuff. The scream made Kiera focus on Hugo, and she flew over to him. However, she was also horrified at what was behind the case. Behind the bookcase was a giant hole. It might have been part of the construction, or it was made when this building was used in the 80s. What shocked them was what was lying in the hole. A skeleton. There was a skeleton inside the hole, some skin still hanging from the bones, as well as some threads around the chest area. It was sitting upright, slumped against the pole inside the hole. Next to the body was a leather backpack, still fully intact. On the backpack was an engraving that made both of the teens' blood run cold. Kiera A. Jenkins. Hugo wanted to throw up. He had never seen a dead body before, but it just had to be the body of the girl he had been so fond of these past few months. He would not be able to unsee that ever again. He mechanically turned his head towards Kiera, but the words died from his mouth. Kiera was furious. She remembered everything now, how she was killed and who did it. Her eyes were back to black. Her mouth was stretched into that awful and creepy black smile. Her hair floated up and got sharper, her face pale as snow. The hand she had on Hugo's shoulder now held a tight grip, her nails slightly scratching his skin. Kiera. Her name left his mouth, but she suddenly disappeared in a flash. Hugo was left alone, staring at the empty space where Kiera had been. His heart was in his throat, and his brain refused to work properly. He gulped, his throat suddenly very dry. He shakily stood up and moved closer to the dead body. He took in a deep breath and cringed as he reached and grabbed the leather backpack. The smell was filling his nose, and it was disgusting. He quickly grabbed the bag and took a couple steps back, his hand over his mouth and nose. He made it out of the room and closed the door tight. He would have to go back later, preferably with the police. He jogged back to the classroom they always used, but she wasn't there. He put the bag down next to him and continued to search the entire building, even the newer school building. But Kiera was not there. He cursed and went back to grab his stuff. He opened the leather backpack and searched for something in there, but most of the books and paper were almost gone. He found a sticker of a park that looked familiar to him. Hugo knew where this park was, since it was still there, even after all these years. He hauled his own bag on his back and grabbed Kiera's old bag. Hugo sprinted out of the school, getting a few weird looks from his teammates. He ignored everything and ran all the way to Hallway Park. Once he got there, it was dark, and he panted as he stopped. He looked around and saw Kiera sitting at the top of a building, looking over the park. Hugo ran towards the building and scanned the outside. Luckily, there were stairs, so he could easily make it to the roof. As he got on the roof, Kiera's back was towards him. He could see her shaking, and he heard her sobbing. It broke his heart to see her like this. He cautiously made his way over, and when she didn't do anything, he sat next to her on the edge. He had dropped both backpacks behind him and leaned on his arms as he put his hands on the ground. They both sat there in silence, and when Hugo looked at Kiera, he could see that she was back to normal, still sobbing, but her eyes were back to that soft green. "I'm sorry," Hugo eventually said. Kiera gasped a little, but didn't say anything. "I had no idea that was there. I wish I could just..." He trailed off, not really sure what he should say. "I remember." Kiera's voice was soft and scratchy, full of emotion. Hugo looked at her in surprise. Her eyes were focused on her hands that were laying in her lap. "I remember how 3 people, a girl and 2 boys, were messing with me for being smart. They wanted me to do their homework, but I refused. One of the guys pulled out a knife to threaten me. I stood my ground. They didn't like that. Suddenly the knife was at my throat, and he slit it." Her sobs came back. She buried her face in her hands. "I don't know what happened after, but..." Hugo placed a hand on her shoulder, and she flinched. Kiera looked at him, and he smiled. "Come." Hugo opened his arms, and Kiera hesitated for only a second before she shot towards him and buried her face in his chest. Hugo put his arms around her shoulders and softly caressed her hair. "I'm going to call the police," he whispered. "I will show them that I stumbled upon your body. They will hopefully be able to provide some more information, maybe even contact your parents." Kiera full-on wailed at the mention of her parents and nodded his chest. I tried to search for them, but I can't find them," she hiccuped. Hugo hummed and gave her a small kiss on her head. "If you tell me their names, then I can tell the police. They will be punished, Kiera. I will make sure." Hugo's voice turned lower and more dangerous. Kiera looked up from his chest and put her hands on his cheeks. Her eyes were red and puffy, tears were still flowing down her cheeks, and she looked tired. Hugo just saw her eyes, sparkling, with what he wasn't sure, but he couldn't take it anymore. He slowly leaned in, and when Kiera's eyes went to his lips, he made his move. He softly pressed his lips on hers, and Kiera sighed. It was wet and cold, but didn't expect any different. Hugo had been daydreaming about kissing his ghost friend. He wondered if it would be even possible, but he was always able to touch her, so it shouldn't pose a problem. It was more than all right. Even though they were cold, her lips were soft. He did no more than just connect their lips, since he didn't want to scare Kiera. But he wanted more. Oh, he wanted more. And Kiera noticed. She tilted her head, and this time Hugo gasped. She took this moment to softly bite his underlip, and he pressed his tongue between her lips. Kiera opened her mouth more and played with his tongue with her own. It was still soft and slow, but it was perfect for them. Her saliva tasted like lemon, and he was pleasantly surprised by how well she was kissing him. Hugo wanted her to take the lead, since he did not know how far she wanted to go. Eventually they had to stop. Hugo's jaw was hurting, and he was getting lightheaded. He softly pushed her away, just enough to stop their lip locking. His cheeks were flushed, but Kiera noticed that she liked that. Hugo put his forehead on hers and kept her in his arms for who knows how long. Hugo bit his lip as the police closed off the room with caution tape. Kiera was next to him, but nobody was able to see her. The police were busy getting the body out of there. Hugo had also given them the backpack, apologizing for taking it. The school had also been notified, and the principal was called from his home. It was a busy time and also devastating. Hugo wasn't allowed to get back into the school, but Kiera was also not getting in. She didn't know why, but they didn't care. They were sticking close to each other for as long as they could. Hugo Lowe? Hugo snapped out of his thoughts as a detective walked up to him. He turned around to the officer and was glad he could feel Kiera behind him. I understand that you found the body. He nodded, not trusting his voice. Do you want to come to the station to answer a couple questions? The detective was kind and offered him a soft smile. Yeah, Hugo said, following him towards the car. Kiera was floating behind him, and they both entered the car. What were you doing in the old building? Detective Benjamin Kelly asked him. They were seated in the sitting room at the station. Hugo was glad he was not in the interrogation room. I study there. It is quiet, and my friends can bother me there, he answered. Kiera was still behind him and softly rubbing his back. It was really nice to have her there. How did you find the room? I was curious about the building, so I searched around. There was a padlock on the door, but it was almost rusted off. I couldn't help my curiosity. Hugo rubbed the back of his head in shame. I broke it off and went into the room. There was a different color on the ground around the bookcase, so I moved it away. That earned a strange look, Hugo noticed. I am in the football team in school. I train regularly. Plus, there weren't a lot of books in there to begin with. Hugo gulped, suddenly nervous. I screamed when I noticed that there was a body in there. I wanted to leave the room, but my feet didn't move. He put his head in his hands, his elbows leaning on his knees. I see, Detective Kelly said, writing down what he said. Then why did you take the backpack? The suspicion was clear in his voice, and Hugo raised his head again. I don't know. I saw the name and thought that I could maybe find the person, but... Hugo sighed. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make it harder for you, but I did find the old student ledgers. Hugo grabbed his own backpack and pulled out an old book. He handed it to the detective and continued. After I called you, I found this on the ground. I grabbed it and got out of the room. I was lucky that it was the yearbook from 1985. The name is also there, with a picture. Detective Kelly flipped through the book and stopped at the students. He found Kiera and confirmed her name.
We will have to do a DNA check, also inform her parents, but it is most likely her. The detective sighed and rubbed his face. The only problem is we have no idea who it could have been. Hugo bit his lip. He had gotten the names from Kiera, so he knew who it was, but he could not exactly say that. We will get in contact with the old classmates. They might know something. He turned back to the teenager. You can go now. If we have any more questions, we will contact you. They both stood up and shook hands. Detective Kelly guided him to the exit, and Hugo thanked him once more. He turned to Kiera and gave her a soft smile. Let's go home, he whispered. Kiera nodded and put her hands on his shoulders while they walked. She had his back. Hugo's parents smothered him when he returned home. The police had called them, informing them that his son had found a body. Even the twins were quiet and asking if he was okay. He told them that it was fine and he just needed rest. After telling them for the 100th time that he was fine, they let him go. Hugo closed the door to his room and sighed. It was already midnight and he was exhausted. Kiera was suddenly in front of him and gave him a soft peck on his lips. This made him smile and he embraced her. The first steps, he mumbled. He felt her nod. Sleep. Wait. He looked her in the eyes. Do you even sleep? Kiera giggled and shook her head. No, I don't need to. This actually made him feel bad, but before she could say more, she put her finger on his lips. It's okay, you can just sleep. Hugo sighed but let her go and started to undress. He heard her squeak and looked at Kiera to see her covering her eyes, and she started to glow pink. Hugo laughed. He couldn't help it. He had not expected her to turn pink, and he was also embarrassed for taking off his clothes. He didn't really think. He quickly put on his sweatpants and shirt. He flopped onto his bed and beckoned her to come over. Are you sure? Kiera's voice was still squeaky, but he just gave her a comforting smile and nodded. The ghost girl made her way over and laid next to him, over the covers. Hugo sighed and closed his eyes, mumbling a good night to Kiera. She softly ruffled his hair and watched as he fell asleep. Kiera snuggled closer and rested her head on his chest. Whatever happened next, they were together.